I was very sceptical about there being any significant change coming out of the end of the Super League, because it feels like we've seen this in politics, we've seen this in world history, where something happens, there's an outcry, a committee gets put in place by the politicians, and it takes a long time, and everybody's emotion slowly dies, and all of a sudden we're back to the status quo. But there felt like something a little bit different happened at the weekend. I felt that all of a sudden maybe the beginnings of something where the grassroots are going to organise and speak to each other. Perhaps it has the chance for affecting some meaningful change. What's your take on this now, 24 hours on?
Perhaps it does have. And I remember your comments a couple of weeks ago when you couldn't really understand why the protest had come about, and it was more about the terrible timing of it. And I think you absolutely had a point there, but sometimes things just happen. And what happened at Old Trafford on Sunday, yes, the protest was organised for a time and a place, but everything else just happened naturally. Nobody planned to get inside the stadium, and it just this body of people came together, very passionate. You saw the strength of feeling there. They were building on the momentum which had been created in previous weeks since the announcement of the Super League. But nobody had any idea how many people would turn up. Of course, there was talk, I'm going, yeah, he's going. And when he got there, there was a little bit of a social aspect to it, because people had not seen each other for well over a year, because they've not been able to, because there's been no fans at matches since March 2019. And then the images and films, it went around the world. It was the front page of the New York Times, which was exactly what the people there wanted to happen. They feel like they've not been heard for a long, long time. And people saying that this isn't the right way to protest. I totally get that a policeman being injured is not the right way, but nor is just turning up and sitting down there peacefully and being ignored. And they were not ignored. And when people went into the ground and went onto the pitch, yeah, parts of it did go too far. But look at the headlines it's generated. Will the Glazer family look and think, we've had enough because of this now? I don't know. Knowing their previous, it's more about how it affects their bottom line. And it's probably more about the European Super League not happening, at least in its current format, at least at the moment, and then thinking we've maximised this investment. Or maybe, which would spook them more, would be government intervention. So we saw Boris Johnson, of all people, talking 2 weeks ago about emergency legislation, if you like. Action will speak louder than those words. The Conservative government doesn't have the faith of too many football fans for their actions. But in 2005, when the original takeover went through, I went down to Whitehall and met some senior members of the government with other Manchester United fans. And they ushered us in and have a cup of tea and biscuits, and we're awfully sympathetic, and we're going to write a strongly worded letter. There's nothing they could do. There's absolutely nothing they could do. It was a waste of time going to London and taking a day off. So now, if there is legislation to protect things like the Super League happening, to involve fans with more of a voice in football, then that could be a good thing.
And to be honest,
don't know where it goes from there.
That's it. All of a sudden it's up for grabs, right? If the protest had been fairly bland and fans outside and it hadn't made front page news, then there would be no more interest from the politicians. But what has to happen now is that, well, nothing has to happen. They could do the same thing again. There could be more tea and biscuits, or the whatever today's equivalent of it is. But if the pressure is kept up, and if other fans from other clubs join in, there comes a tipping point where the politicians and the Premier League act in concert, and that rebuffs to some degree the Super League. And that might have, as you say, because one of the papers today says that the Glazers are unmoved by this, and their ambition is still to turn Manchester United from a 4 billion valuation to a 10 billion valuation. Much harder to do if you're not in a ring-fenced European Super League.
It is, and that this is what we're absolutely committed to do. We heard similar sounds from the Super League teams just before they pulled out. Today's equivalent of tea and biscuits will probably be tea and biscuits for £7.8 million to one of Conservative Party's senior members' friends, which have been outsourced. But without getting too political about it, that would really help if there is a change in legislation. the Glazers can talk about seeing this out all they like. What they cannot do is act against any changes in legislation. That makes their asset less valuable than it previously was. And it was weak legislation which allowed them to make that highly leveraged buyout of Manchester United in the first place. It was controversial because it should never have been allowed to happen. They loaded debt up against the asset, and Manchester United have been paying interest against those debts for 16 years since. £1.5 billion in interest payments alone. That doesn't include the dividends which are paid to the family. So when Joe Glazer talked about rebuilding trust, there was no trust to rebuild. He's not even communicated for 16 years. So when fans got that letter, that apology, they just didn't accept it. And you can understand why. And these people aren't fundamentalists. These are reasonable people. These are passionate people who love the football club and have done for a long time, but they've also got long memories. And they remember the damage done in 2005. And the Glazers did nothing illegal taking over. They just took advantage of lax laws to do what they did. And in many ways, they've been very clever. And yes, they have increased commercial revenues, and they've benefited from increased broadcast revenues as well. And revenues are up across Manchester United. But have they plateaued? Is it looking less attractive if there's no European Super League? Or is this just another little storm that they're going to see out?
What happened with the protests in 2010, and how was that dealt with from the perspective of the club, and how did that end up concluding?
Faded away. It faded away. Manchester United were in the middle of a run of reaching 3 European Cup finals in 4 years. So it wasn't about the team. People often mistake this and say, it's because you're not the best team anymore. It's not really. It's not about that. Actually, the team's doing really well. The manager's doing a good job. If you'd said to any Manchester United fan at the start of this season, you'll be second, well clear of Liverpool by May, and you'll have the prospect of a European final. Okay, it's not the Champions League. I think people would have accepted that. And that's where we are with the team. But it faded away. So you have all these really strong images of David Beckham wearing a green and gold scarf. And it became something where the grafters and the swag workers of Manchester ended up selling green and gold scarves to tourists who then went into the ground having bought a ticket, went into the megastore to buy merchandise. There were ironies all over the place. But of course, they had the support of Sir Alex Ferguson at the time, David Gill, the predecessor for Ed Woodward. He was firm in his position. There's been changes this time. Ed Woodward has resigned. The Glazers have apologised. Whether they just think that they can move on from here is up to them. I don't know what their line of thinking is, but the fans, as you saw on Sunday, feel very strongly about this, and they want to impact change. Change can be better for everybody. Fans need to be consulted. If fans were consulted, that Super League might have had half a chance, rather than just being dropped in the middle of a pandemic where people have been locked up. Some people are almost looking for a reason to protest. So the way that it was dropped in just shows how out of touch the owners are, sat distanced from the reality with no communication into what the actual people on the ground are thinking. And it blew up in their faces, and with good reason.
On that then, is there a way back for the Glazers in the mind of United? Like, as you say, there was never any trust to rebuild, considering it was never there in the first place. Is there any avenue that you would like to see happen here where things can get even a little bit better with them in power?
I'd like to see reform. I'd like to see legislative changes. I think if you just left it to them, nothing would change it. And some of the core issues have been improved. Ticket prices rose significantly in the first 5 years under the Glazers, and they've not gone up in the last 10 years. I think you've got to welcome stuff like that. And people at the club had worked really hard to communicate with fans. You've got the area in the Stretford end, which is full of atmosphere now. That's a definite improvement. Looking at bigger projects, the development of Old Trafford, the Glazers basically stalled it since 2006. Maybe they might say because it was complete, but it wasn't. And Old Trafford was looking a bit noughties, a bit 90s in as recently as 2018 because there was paint peeling. Now it has been spruced up during the pandemic. I think £20 million has been spent on Old Trafford. But the fans have got very, very little faith in the Glazers. We're not talking a situation here like at Liverpool where there's regular communication between their owners and their fans, and where they can turn around and say, yep, here's one European Cup, here's the league title. They're now just memories for Manchester United. Ferguson is now just a memory for Manchester United fans. There hasn't been a title win since 2013. A lot of money has been spent and wasted and spent pretty badly, but it's hardly the Glazers' money. This is the money of Manchester United fans. They don't need a benefactor. They don't need an oligarch. The club's big enough to stand on its own 2 feet. And if United fans could have more influence, we're able to buy shares. If there was some sort of fan representation on the board, then it can help football. It can stop things happening like teams signing up for a European Super League without consulting anybody.
It's funny that those steps that you're talking about aren't actually that radical, and in a way might be a way out for the owners. You know, add fan representation to the board. That fan is then charged with being the point person for the communication with the fans, and they're free to reveal whatever it is that they hear within certain limits. Improve communication, and all of a sudden you can see the relationship beginning at some basis point where it's understood that there won't be a Super League unless the whole European football pyramid votes for it, which is essentially kind of what we have in many respects with the new Champions League. So there's definitely a way out of this, but that's assuming that the protests don't go any further. In your view, and from what you're hearing, and particularly, I know you're heading to Rome for the away game this week, that hardcore of away fans that would have been going with you this week and that you would have met, what is their view on whether or not these protests should continue, and can they continue to make the front pages and to set the news agenda?
I don't think that would be happening in Rome, because I think I'm the only person going. After this interview, I'm going to have yet another PCR test to go there and travel there. And there could be a European final in Gdansk. There should be to follow. Look, I don't think the Glazers are ever going to be popular. I just don't. I think if they decided to sell up tomorrow, that would be celebrated by Manchester United fans. There's too much history. There's too much water under the bridge. There's too much division. There was a split in the fan base in 2005. You had your breakaway FC United club formed, and I know people who've not spoken since 2005, people who were previously close friends, and they just fractured that community. And did they care about that? I don't think that they did do. If they didn't have the majority ownership of Manchester United, that would be welcomed. And the easy way of doing that is by saying, okay, sell more than 50% now. Would they be willing to do that? It's doubtful. Fans had placards on Sunday saying 50+1. I'd be surprised if that happened. That's a lot to aim for, but why shouldn't the fans aim high? You can see the strength of feeling. It is making headlines around the world, but something has got to change, because the current system is not working with the owners at Manchester United, but also in football. You have fit and proper people who are anything but taking charge of football clubs on the doorstep of Manchester, places like Macclesfield, Blackpool, Bury, at Bolton, at Wigan. I'm talking the majority of the clubs here. And Manchester United fans live in these areas. They support Man United, but they care about the local clubs as well. They go watch them. They don't want to see them going bust. And I think this lack of regulation in football, the lack of an independent regulator, this has allowed takeovers like this to happen. And of course, the laws in the financial market as well. And it's not just about Manchester United. You've seen the protests from Arsenal fans with Stan Kroenke. It's slightly different at Liverpool, definitely different at Manchester City. At Chelsea, they were well up against the Super League, and there's mutiny in the air. There's protests in the air. Does it fade away like previous protests? I just don't know, any more than I don't know whether that the Glazers want to sell up. But among those people, among the hardcore, the strength of feeling is very strong. They feel that Sunday was a success. They feel voiceless, exploited. They feel that people actually took notice of them on Sunday, and they want change to come from that.
Well, I hope you're right, and I hope they continue to protest, because at least then this will continue to be a story and the politicians will have to do something.